Okay, let's talk about the way the NCAA is trying to prevent shenanigans with the roster. So the NCAA published a 36 page Q&A on implementation of the House settlement. A lot of discussion about the roster, particularly important for student athletes. Let's start there. Let's talk about the roster. Right off the rip, all this discussion about walk-on athletes and this optional provision where the institution has the ability to put walk-on athletes back on the roster without counting towards the roster limit. Okay? So that can happen. It is optional at the discretion of the university. But here's what's not optional. It's a firm deadline for the institution to put you back on the roster. And that firm deadline is July 6th, 2025. So here we are on Juneteenth, June 19th, 2025. You have until July 6th if you are a walk-on athlete to be placed on a roster. If you are not, it's over. You cannot ever get on a roster again. Okay, at least associated with the sport and in the way it's currently architected. Okay, so if you're a designated student athlete that was a walk-on in the prior year, okay, you got to be assigned to another roster by July 6th or you will not be able to play. Okay, now, so that's important for walk-ons because there was all this discussion about walk-ons. Now, the other thing that was interesting is there's always this conversation about the way the transfer portal is worked is that coaches have been pushing players into the transfer portal. And what we have thought that meant was that you get pushed into the portal. If you do not get picked up, you don't have the scholarship at the school that you were at because you entered the portal and you've not entered another school. Okay. And so you are on mama's couch. Okay. And so there's something in the back of folks' minds that think there's a lot of that happening. I don't know how much pushing folks into the portal is actually happening. That being said, okay, if you are told that you have to enter the portal, so you're being pushed in, okay, understand the institution cannot take your scholarship. Now, they cannot put you on the roster, but they cannot take your scholarship. Okay. And so I don't know if that's cold comfort or heartwarming to individuals, but the notion that you will not lose your ability to get an education by being potentially pushed into the portal is important for you to know. Okay. They reiterate, the NCAA, that tampering is still impermissible. Okay. Okay. Thank you for reiterating that. Now, if an athlete loses their roster spot, they can still keep their scholarship in most cases. Okay. It's only when they voluntarily relinquish the spot is the potential loss of scholarship available. So who's tracking these rosters? Okay. There's a new system called CAPS that will be overseen by the College Sports Commission that is going to be the system of record for the roster. And there are firm deadlines and limits on when institutions have to have the rosters into this system across all sports, NCAA sports. Okay. Now, once the roster is submitted, it is fixed. With some exceptions we'll discuss, it's fixed. Okay. For the rest of the season or the end of the academic year, whichever is later. So with respect to baseball, okay, the end of the season will come after the end of the academic year. So it's the end of the season in that case. With respect to football and basketball, okay, the end of the season will occur prior to the end of the academic year. So the roster is fixed through the academic year in those cases. Okay, a couple of examples there. Now we talked about walk-ons and you got to be on the roster before the end of the deadline. Okay. We also want to clarify that walk-ons do not count towards the roster limit. So football is the easiest one to remember, 105 roster slots. Okay. Football, if they were walk-ons that were previously on the team, they will not lose their spots at the discretion of the institution, but they do not count towards the 105 football athlete limit. Okay. Roster limit. Now, that said, walk-ons, if they get aid, if they get scholarship, if they get any kind of aid, it does count towards the rev share cap, the $20.5 million. Okay. Now, also with respect to walk-ons, because this discussion about their freedom of movement. Okay. If you get that status called the designated student athlete, which means that you were a walk-on athlete on a roster in the prior school year, 24-25. Okay. You will always have that special designation, and you will always be eligible, so long as you have eligibility, to be an athlete above the roster limit. So you will not ever count towards roster limits. That said, okay, so that means that you can take your designated status to another school. You can transfer, you can join another squad, and you will always be above the roster limit. Now, but if you transfer, you take that designation with you, you can't take it back to the prior school. So if you leave one school and want to go back, you are no longer a designated student athlete with respect to the prior school that you left. Okay? Let's talk about replacing people on rosters. There's just a couple ways that folks can get replaced on a roster. Okay, so you can't get pushed into the portal and get replaced on the roster. You can't do that. Okay. You cannot be, if you are injured during the season, you cannot be replaced on the roster. Your scholarship still holds. You do not play because you're injured. Okay, but you cannot be replaced on the current year's roster. If that injury is a lingering injury, you can be replaced on the subsequent year's roster, but not on the current year's roster. Okay. The other couple of examples of when you can be replaced. If you run out of eligibility, obviously, though we have all this debate about what eligibility, means. Zakai Ziegler, I'm talking about you. Okay. And if you enter the draft, in those scenarios, you can be replaced on the roster. So if you're injured, you run out of eligibility, you are injured before the first game is played, and if you enter the draft. Those are the three basic ones. There are a few margin examples. If you're injured during the season, you cannot be replaced. Also, interestingly, January enrollees, which is particularly important for football in D1, okay, do count toward the roster limits. They have to be put on the roster. So I don't know how schools are going to navigate those folks, okay, but they count towards the roster limits. So those are some of the high points around rosters. Their potential shenanigans, especially on the replacement front, that the NCAA tried to clear up, is like, you can't just be moving people in and out of the roster. Once it's firm, with some minor or narrow exceptions. Walk-on athletes, you got until July 6th to get on the roster. If you're not, it's over. Okay, so that's it for now. As always, want to hear what you think. Let me know.